Hi, welcome back. This is lesson 62, Twisted Stockinette Stitch, and this is for the second block of your lap throw that I show in lesson 60. And I'm not going to be showing the border since you already did that in the last lesson. I'll just show you the inset. And in this version of this, I twisted the stitches on every single row. You don't really have to do that. You notice it's a little tighter, and by twisting the stitches on every row, it swings over that leg of the stitch and almost blocks or obliterates the vertical segments. In this version of this sample, I twisted these stitches on every other row rather than every single row. And you'll notice that we still have the leg that gets swung, but we still have the vertical segments that show. This version is a little bit looser, and of course it's a little easier to knit because you only have to twist the stitches on every other row. So I'll show you both ways to do it. I like the way this looks, but you'll notice you have to be more careful than I was because some of the strands are a little loose because they almost get spun with your fingers. You're making that twisted stitch. So let's get started. And again, I'm not going to show you the border. Look back at lesson 61 to see how I did this. So if you want to twist the stitches on every other row, all you need to do, I'm on an odd number of rows. So for this sample, I have been twisting the stitches when I'm knitting from my right to left pipe. In other words, my odd number rows. And when I take the stitch off to front stitch it, I bring it forward and I put it over my working yarns. But instead of piping it in the normal fashion like so, I'm just going to turn the stitch so it faces the other direction, and the working yarn now comes through the old stitch around the pipe and to the outside. And each stitch is going to be made the same way. So when I take off the old stitch, which looks normal, I'm going to pull the working yarn through and turn it clockwise essentially with the working yarn to the outside. And each stitch in the row is made the same way. Now theoretically, if you wanted to, you could just twist the stitch right before you knit it when you make the next row. But I think that's harder to remember to do. If you're like me and you knit on automatic pilot, it's easier to twist as I'm making the stitch and knitting the row. And every time your working yarn should be coming through the old stitch around the pipe and to the outside. Now, when you knit your even number row, this time you front stitch in the normal fashion. So take your stitch off, put it over the working yarns, hold that stitch back, the old stitch, so that you can get your working yarns, pull them through, pipe it, and now the working yarns to the inside. Now notice though, that was a little tricky, that last one. When you take this stitch off, it doesn't look like it normally does because you've twisted it when you made it the last row. If I turned this counterclockwise, now it looks like it normally does. But I twisted it when I made it the last time. But see how much smaller my stitch is now. So you want to make sure that when you make those stitches, you have enough space. You know, make them loosely, is what I'm saying. And then, again, if you're not twisting this row, just pipe it in the normal fashion. Again, it's going to look twisted when you take it off, and you're not going to have much space to work. So you can pull on the yarn a little bit. You know, there isn't a lot of elasticity to this yarn, but there's some. There's enough. Make sure these don't loosen up too much as you're making the next stitch. And then if you want to, kind of straighten these out a little bit as they're going around the rod. Because when you're working with these 6 strands, they tend to kind of notice how that switch tries to twist like that around itself. If you just want to neaten up your yarn strands. And again, this row is made in the normal fashion if you want to do the version that I've been working on here in this sample. Okay, so now we're back to the right hand side. It's an odd number row, and we're going to make our stitch and twist it just like so. Whoop. Make sure you have that pushed back there far enough because it wants to want to pull off at the first stitch. If you were making a whole afghan with this twisted stitch, I would suggest using one size bigger pipe because it is going to tighten up your knitting. But for this little panel, that's okay. You're only working 12 stitches in this pattern. Now, if you wanted to make it as my panel, where you twisted every row, then when you begin the next row, and take off your stitch, and again, you're going to have to push back that old stitch, make sure you get the working yarns. And when you pipe it not like this, but like this. So take the stitch off, it will appear twisted, like so. Make yourself some room, get in there with your finger, pull the stitch up, and turn it just like so. In this case, you know, it's basically a mirror image. Now you're turning the stitch, I guess that would be counterclockwise there. So the working yarn is coming through the old stitch and getting turned, and the working yarn is coming through the old stitch around the pipe and to the outside. You know, don't be afraid to stretch that stitch out a little bit. Notice how I'm kind of pulling on that stitch somewhat and just bringing the yarns through. Again, this would be a little easier if you were doing this on the Schedule 40 pipe. And then when you go to knit this row, this is also going to be a twisted row, so watch that stitch as you take it off. Make sure you have plenty of space to get in there, turn it, put it on. And this time when you do this row, whoops, keep those guys on while you're doing it. When you go to knit this row, these will be twisted. You can push it up or pull it up. And again, this one gets twisted clockwise. So you're knitting mirror image rows of twisted stitches. If you knit every single row twisted, it will be a little easier if you make a mistake to fix it, because then you know that every single stitch is twisted. But it is a little tighter, the final piece, and I should have shown you the back side. It is not reversible if you want to knit a whole throw in this. This is the front, and this is the back, so it appears as a little tighter version of how the purl side of stockinette would normally look. So that's how you knit twisted stockinette stitch. Thanks for watching.